October 17th, 2025. Gold breaches $4,300 per ounce, a number that would have seemed absurd just 18 months ago. In the trading rooms of London and Zurich, where fortunes pivot on decimal points, something unprecedented is happening. The world's oldest currency, the metal that financed empires and bankrupted kings, is surging with a velocity that defies every traditional metric. Central banks are hoarding it. Investors are fleeing into it. And in the corridors where power speaks in whispers, a question hangs unspoken. Is this a warning or the beginning of something far more dangerous? Because this isn't just about price. This is about trust. And what happens when the institutions that hold the world together realize they can no longer trust each other? The numbers tell a story that most will never hear. In 2024 alone, central banks purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold for the third consecutive year, a buying spree unmatched since records began in 1950. Poland led the charge, adding 90 tons. India quietly accumulated 73. Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, nations from every corner of the globe, all moving in perfect synchronicity toward the same ancient asset. And China, enigmatic as ever, resumed buying in November after a conspicuous 6-month pause, adding to reserves that analysts suspect are far larger than Beijing publicly admits. Some estimates put China's actual holdings at over 5,000 tons, more than double what appears in official reports. This is not investment. This is preparation. For what, exactly, is the question that should keep you awake at night? When does survival become betrayal? It's a question older than currency itself, whispered in the counting houses of medieval Florence and the war rooms of 20th century capitals. But on February 28, 2022, it became the defining moral paradox of our age. For days after Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, Western governments executed what one Russian official called a financial nuclear bomb. They froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Not seized, not confiscated, frozen. The distinction matters, legally and philosophically, but the message was unmistakable. Your dollars, your euros, your carefully accumulated hedge against catastrophe. They exist only at our pleasure. The money was there, in accounts across London, Brussels, New York, untouchable but visible, like a fortune locked behind glass. Russia could see it, measure it, but not use it. And every central banker from Beijing to Brasilia understood immediately. If it could happen to Moscow, it could happen to them. The world economic order we inhabit was not designed. It was improvised in the wreckage of World War II. In July 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Berlin, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and made a wager on the future. They bet that the United States, emerging as the sole economic superpower with most of the world's gold reserves, could be trusted to anchor the global monetary system. The dollar became the sun around which all other currencies orbited, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. It was brilliant. It was fragile. And it worked until it didn't. By 1971, with Vietnam draining American gold reserves and inflation gnawing at confidence, President Nixon severed the link. The dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. From that moment forward, every dollar, every euro, every yuan was backed not by precious metal, but by faith. Faith in governments, in central banks, in the idea that the paper in your wallet represented more than the ink printed on it. For 50 years, that faith held. It made the dollar the world's reserve currency, the medium through which 60% of all foreign exchange reserves flowed, the language in which 90% of global transactions were spoken. But faith, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. The cracks have been forming long before Ukraine. For 2 decades, the dollar's share of global reserves had been drifting downward, from nearly 70% at the turn of the millennium to just under 58% by late 2024. It was gradual, almost imperceptible, the kind of decline you notice only when you look back across years. Central banks diversified into euros, yen, even the currencies of smaller economies like Australia and Canada. But the real shift, the one that signaled something deeper than mere portfolio rebalancing, was the turn toward gold. Emerging markets led the charge. Russia, scarred by Western sanctions after annexing Crimea in 2014, began selling off dollar reserves and buying gold aggressively. Between 2015 and 2020, Moscow accumulated hundreds of tons, building its reserves to over 2,000 metric tons, even as it reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds to nearly zero. China followed a similar path, quietly expanding its gold reserves while signing currency swap agreements with dozens of nations, creating channels for trade that bypassed the dollar entirely. Turkey, battered by inflation and a collapsing currency, poured resources into gold, seeing it as a lifeline in a storm of its own making. These were not isolated decisions. They were symptoms of a deeper malaise, a growing suspicion that the system, as constructed, served the interests of its architects more than its participants. Then came the freeze. When Russian central bank assets were immobilized in February 2022, it wasn't just a sanction, it was a revelation. The implicit contract that underpinned the global financial system, the idea that reserves held in foreign currencies were inviolable, had been rewritten overnight. Yes, Russia had committed an act of aggression. Yes, the invasion of Ukraine was a violation of international law. But for central bankers and capitals far removed from the conflict, the legal justifications mattered less than the precedent. If the West could freeze the reserves of a G20 nation, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, then reserves were not safe. They were hostages to geopolitics. Within weeks, the buying began in earnest. Poland, bordering Ukraine and acutely aware of its vulnerability, announced plans to increase its gold holdings to 20% of total reserves. It purchased 67 tons in the first half of 2025 alone, extending a buying streak that had transformed it into the world's largest central bank gold purchaser. India's Reserve Bank, traditionally conservative, quietly added to its stockpile every single month. Even smaller nations, Czech Republic, Qatar, Ghana, began accumulating gold with a determination that suggested coordination, though none was officially acknowledged. The message was clear. In a world where assets can be frozen at the stroke of a pen, only gold, physical, unencumbered sovereign gold, is truly safe. The mechanics of what happened next are as fascinating as they are ominous. When central banks buy gold, they don't just write a check and wait for delivery. They reconfigure their entire reserve strategy, shifting away from interest-bearing assets like U.S. Treasury bonds and into a metal that generates no income but cannot be erased from existence by political decree. This has consequences. As foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries declined, from over 50% of the market during the 2008 financial crisis to just 30% by early 2025, the burden of financing America's ballooning debt fell increasingly on domestic investors. Interest rates rose, not because of inflation alone, but because the world's appetite for dollar-denominated debt was waning. The irony is exquisite. By weaponizing the dollar, the United States may have accelerated the very process it sought to prevent, the erosion of the dollar's dominance. And gold, dismissed for decades as a relic, a barbarous remnant of a pre-modern age, became the ultimate hedge against a system eating itself from within. If stories like this fascinate you, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more hidden chapters of history to light. The price surge that began in late 2024 was not driven by traditional factors. Gold doesn't care about interest rates or inflation expectations the way it used to. Those relationships, once predictable, have frayed. What matters now is fear. Not the acute panic that follows a market crash, but the slow, grinding dread of institutions hedging against scenarios they cannot publicly acknowledge. When J.P. Morgan raised its forecast in February 2025, predicting gold would average $3,675 per ounce by year's end, it wasn't because of economic data. It was because central bank demand, which the bank initially estimated at 50 tons per month, had surged to over 100 tons in December 2024 alone. The buying was relentless, and it was accelerating. By April 2025, as tariff wars between the United States and China escalated, and the Trump administration's erratic trade policies sent shockwaves through global markets. Gold breached $3,500. It held there for weeks, then climbed again, driven by a kind of gravitational pull that defied conventional analysis. Investors piled into gold exchange-traded funds after 2 years of outflows. Institutions scrambled to secure physical bars and retail demand in Asia, where gold has always carried cultural as well as financial significance, reached levels not seen since the 2008 crisis. The World Gold Council reported that total demand in 2024, measured in value, reached $382 billion, the highest in history. And still, the question lingered. Was this a bubble, or was it the market finally pricing in a truth that policymakers refuse to admit? There's a technical term in finance for what happens when everyone realizes the same thing at once: a regime change. It doesn't mean the old system collapses overnight. Regime changes are rarely that dramatic. It means the rules that govern behavior for decades stop working, and participants begin acting on a new set of assumptions without quite articulating what those assumptions are. The shift away from a dollar is a regime change. The rise of gold is a symptom. Central banks aren't abandoning dollars en masse. They're reducing their exposure incrementally, hedging against risks they cannot fully quantify but sense instinctively. The dollar still accounts for 88% of foreign exchange transactions, 60% of disclosed reserves, 70% of foreign currency debt issuance. It remains, by any measure, the dominant currency. But dominance and invincibility are not the same thing. The dollar's share of reserves has fallen from over 70% in 2000 to 58% today, a decline that, while gradual, represents a loss of confidence measured in trillions. And confidence, once lost, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Meanwhile, gold has become something it wasn't 20 years ago, a geopolitical asset. Nations that once stockpiled dollars as insurance against economic shocks now see gold as insurance against the weaponization of the financial system itself. Russia demonstrated this vividly. After its reserves were frozen, Moscow pivoted aggressively toward using its gold stockpile and developing alternatives to the dollar-dominated SWIFT payment network. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, began discussing the creation of a shared currency or payment system that would reduce reliance on Western financial infrastructure. It's not clear whether such a system will ever materialize. The technical, political, and economic hurdles are immense. But the fact that these discussions are happening at all, that nations representing over 40% of the world population are openly exploring alternatives, is itself a signal. The unipolar financial order, anchored by the dollar and enforced by American economic might, is fracturing. What comes next is unclear, but it will not be a return to the status quo. Let's talk about what this means in concrete terms. If you're an average person, living in a stable democracy with a functioning currency, the immediate impact of de-dollarization and rising gold prices may seem abstract, but the second-order effects are profound. Higher gold prices reflect lower confidence in the stability of fiat currencies, which translates to higher inflation expectations, which in turn drives up borrowing costs for governments, corporations, and individuals. The decline in foreign demand for U.S. Treasuries forces the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates elevated even as economic growth slows, creating a painful bind. If you're trying to buy a house, start a business, or simply service existing debt, you feel it. And if you live in an emerging market, the situation is even more precarious. As central banks divert resources into gold, they have less capacity to intervene in foreign exchange markets to stabilize their own currencies. This creates volatility, which breeds capital flight, which exacerbates the very instability that prompted the gold buying in the first place. It's a vicious cycle, and we're only beginning to see its consequences unfold. The European Union, which holds the bulk of frozen Russian assets, approximately 210 billion euros worth, faces a dilemma that encapsulates the broader crisis. What do you do with money that legally belongs to another country, but morally, or at least politically, should be used to support the nation that country invaded. In October 2024, the G7 countries reached an agreement to use the interest generated by these frozen assets, about 4 billion euros per year, to fund loans to Ukraine. It's a compromise, a way to provide support without crossing the Rubicon of outright confiscation. But it also exposes the limits of the West's options. If Russia were to somehow regain access to its frozen reserves through a negotiated settlement, a change in Western policy, or simply the passage of time, the precedent set by their freezing would remain. And every central bank watching this unfold understands that precedents, once established, can be applied to others. This is why Poland increased its gold reserves. This is why India repatriated 100 tons of gold from the United Kingdom in 2024, bringing it back to domestic vaults. This is why even nations aligned with the West are quietly hedging their bets. Trust, once weaponized, becomes a liability. Goldman Sachs, in its revised forecast, noted that if policy uncertainty remains elevated and concerns about U.S. government debt continue to drive demand for safe haven assets, gold could reach $3,300 per ounce by December 2025. It's a conservative estimate. Other analysts, looking at the same data, see prices climbing toward 4,000 or beyond. The divergence in projections reflects genuine uncertainty about the path forward. Will the dollar stabilize? Will central bank buying plateau? Will new sources of supply, from increased mining production or recycling, cool the market? Or will we look back on this moment as the inflection point, the beginning of a broader unraveling? The uncomfortable truth is that no one knows. Markets are forward-looking, but they're also reflexive. They respond to their own momentum as much as to underlying fundamentals. And right now, the momentum in gold is driven not by greed, but by fear. Fear of inflation, fear of geopolitical chaos, fear that the institutions designed to provide stability are themselves the source of instability. There's a philosophical dimension to this that we rarely discuss in financial terms, the nature of value itself. Gold has no intrinsic utility beyond its use in electronics and dentistry, industries that consume a fraction of annual production. It doesn't generate income. It doesn't grow. It just sits there, inert and gleaming, valued because humans have agreed for millennia that it is valuable. Fiat currencies, by contrast, are backed by the productive capacity of economies that issue them and the legal framework that enforces their use. In theory, a dollar represents a claim on the goods and services produced by the American economy. In practice, it represents whatever the market believes it represents at any given moment. And belief, we are learning, is contingent. The rise of gold is a vote of no confidence, not in any particular currency, but in the idea that governments can be trusted to manage the value of money responsibly. It's a reversion to a pre-modern logic, a recognition that when institutions fail, tangible assets endure. This is not irrational. It's deeply, disturbingly rational. The story of de-dollarization is often told as a clash of great powers, a struggle between the United States and China for economic dominance. But that narrative misses the broader pattern. This is not about one hegemon replacing another. It's about the diffusion of power itself. The multipolar world that strategists have long predicted is emerging, not through deliberate design, but through the uncoordinated actions of dozens of nations, each pursuing its own interests, each hedging against its own vulnerabilities. The BRICS, for all their rhetoric about creating a new financial order, have no unified vision. Their economies are too diverse, their political systems too divergent. China wants to internationalize the yuan, but maintains strict capital controls that make it unattractive as a reserve currency. Russia wants to escape Western sanctions, but its economy is too dependent on commodity exports to function as an independent financial center. India, the world's most populous nation, remains cautious, balancing ties with the West against its historical non-aligned stance. What unites these nations is not a shared ideology, but a shared grievance. The sense that the existing system, for all its flaws, is rigged against them. And gold, neutral, stateless, offers an exit that no single nation can block. Consider the timeline. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, Western sanctions began in earnest. Russia's response was to accelerate gold purchases and reduce dollar holdings. By 2018, Moscow had divested almost entirely from U.S. treasuries. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic upended global supply chains and central banks flooded markets with liquidity, gold surged past $2,000 for the first time, driven by fears of inflation and currency debasement. In 2022, the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent asset freeze transformed gold from a hedge into a necessity. And in 2024, as geopolitical tensions escalated, wars in the Middle East, trade conflicts between the U.S. and China, the specter of a second Trump administration with its unpredictable tariff policies, central bank buying hit record levels. Each crisis, each shock to the system, reinforced the logic of accumulation. And now, in 2025, with gold trading above $4,300, the pattern is undeniable. This is not a temporary flight to safety. This is a structural shift. The irony, of course, is that the very mechanisms designed to enforce global stability, sanctions, asset freezes, the use of financial infrastructure as a weapon, are accelerating the erosion of that stability. The freezing of Russian reserves was justified as a response to aggression, a tool of last resort to pressure Moscow into compliance. But it also revealed the extent to which the global financial system is political, subject to the whims of those who control its infrastructure. And that revelation has had consequences. Countries that once saw dollar reserves as a safe haven now see them as potential leverage in someone else's hands. Gold, by contrast, cannot be frozen. It cannot be sanctioned. It exists outside the system, which is precisely why it has become so valuable within it. This is the paradox at the heart of our current moment. The more the system is weaponized, the more participants seek to escape it. And the more they escape, the weaker the system becomes. Let's zoom out further to the century-long arc. The gold standard, abandoned piecemeal between the Great Depression and the 1970s, was replaced by a system based on trust in institutions and the rule of law. For decades, that system worked remarkably well, facilitating unprecedented economic growth and lifting billions out of poverty. But it was always fragile, dependent on restraint and cooperation among its participants. When those qualities erode, when sanctions become routine and geopolitical rivalry trumps collaboration, the foundation cracks. We are witnessing that erosion in real time. The SWIFT payment network, once seen as neutral infrastructure, is now a tool of statecraft. The International Monetary Fund, designed to stabilize currencies and provide emergency financing, is increasingly sidelined by nations that see it as an instrument of Western policy. Even the European Central Bank has warned against the over-reliance on dollar-denominated assets, a remarkable statement from an institution that has historically championed the status quo. The signs are everywhere for those willing to see them. What happens next depends on choices not yet made, decisions that will unfold over years, not weeks. If the United States can stabilize its fiscal trajectory, reduce its reliance on deficit spending, and restore confidence in the dollar's long-term value, the shift away from it may slow. If Europe can integrate its bond markets and provide a credible alternative reserve asset, the euro could absorb some of the outflows. If China can liberalize its capital account and allow the yuan to float freely, it might challenge the dollar's dominance. But each of these outcomes requires political will that, at present, seems absent. The easier path, the one of least resistance, is fragmentation, a world where multiple currencies coexist, where regional blocs trade in their own systems, where gold serves as the ultimate backstop for nations that trust neither their rivals nor themselves. This is not a collapse. It's a reconfiguration. But reconfigurations, as history teaches, are rarely smooth. The human element in all this is easy to overlook. Behind every central bank purchase order, every shift in reserve strategy, there are individuals making calculations under enormous pressure. Think of the Polish central bank governor, Adam Glapiński, publicly advocating for gold purchases in a country still haunted by memories of Soviet domination. Think of Indian officials navigating between Western partnerships and historical non-alignment, quietly repatriating gold to avoid the fate of Russia. Think of Chinese technocrats managing the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, balancing the need for liquidity with the imperative of reducing vulnerability. These are not villains or heroes. They are functionaries operating within constraints, trying to safeguard their nation's interests in an increasingly unstable world. Their choices, collectively, are reshaping the architecture of global finance. And most of us will never know their names. There's a concept in systems theory called emergent complexity, the idea that simple rules applied by many actors can produce outcomes that no single actor intended or predicted. The current gold surge is an example. No central bank set out to destabilize the dollar. Most would prefer a stable, predictable reserve currency. It makes their jobs easier. But faced with risks they couldn't ignore, they acted rationally, individually. And those individual actions, aggregated, created a feedback loop. Buying drives up prices. Higher prices validate the decision to buy. Validation encourages more buying. It's a self-reinforcing dynamic, and it's accelerating. The question is whether it stabilizes a new equilibrium or spirals into something more chaotic. The historical precedents are not encouraging. Every major currency transition, from the Dutch guilder to the British pound, from the pound to the dollar, has been accompanied by conflict, upheaval, and decades of adjustment. There's no reason to believe this time will be different. And yet, here we are, living through it, largely oblivious. The mechanics of central bank operations are arcane, the language of international finance opaque. Most people, understandably, tune it out, but ignoring it doesn't make it less real. The forces reshaping the global monetary order will determine the value of your savings, the cost of your mortgage, the stability of your job. They will influence whether governments can afford to provide social services, whether wars are financed or forestalled, whether the next generation inherits a world of prosperity or precarity. This is not abstract. It's as tangible as the price of bread, the interest rate on a loan, the confidence you have, or don't have, that tomorrow will resemble today. And right now, that confidence is eroding faster than most realize. The moral question posed at the beginning, when does survival become betrayal, has no easy answer. Was the freezing of Russian assets justified? By the logic of international law and collective self-defense, arguably yes. Did it set a precedent that undermines the foundations of the global financial system? Also yes. Both things can be true. The problem is that moral clarity in one moment creates strategic ambiguity in the next. If Western nations can freeze Russian assets to punish aggression, what stops China from freezing American assets in a future conflict over Taiwan? What stops Saudi Arabia from weaponizing its dollar reserves if U.S. policy shifts in ways it finds intolerable? The answer, uncomfortably, is nothing, except the understanding that doing so would trigger a cascade of retaliation that benefits no one. But understanding and restraint are not the same thing. And in a world where great powers view each other with increasing suspicion, the temptation to act preemptively, to secure advantage before the other side does, grows stronger. Goldman Sachs' forecast of gold reaching $3,100 by year's end now seems almost quaint. As of mid-November 2025, gold has already surpassed that target by over $1,000. The bank's analysts noted upside risks if central bank demand remains elevated, if policy uncertainty persists, if fears about U.S. government debt intensify. All three conditions have materialized and shown no signs of abating. The U.S. national debt exceeds $35 trillion, with interest payments consuming a growing share of the federal budget. Trade conflicts initiated by the Trump administration have fractured long-standing alliances and sown doubts about America's reliability as a partner. And central banks, far from slowing their purchases, have accelerated them. In the first half of 2025 alone, 23 countries increased their gold reserves. This is not a blip. It's a tectonic shift visible in the data if you know where to look, but largely absent from mainstream discourse. Why? Because acknowledging it would require confronting uncomfortable truths about the fragility of the system we've built. Let's return, briefly, to the frozen Russian assets. Not because any nation chooses it, but because no alternative commands universal trust. The dollar, tainted by weaponization. The euro, constrained by political fragmentation. The yuan, limited by capital controls. Gold, by default, becomes the least worst option, neutral, finite, immune to the manipulations that plague fiat currencies. It's not a return to the gold standard. That system's rigidities were part of what broke it. But it could be something like a gold-backed insurance policy, where central banks hold enough physical metal to cushion against the collapse of any single currency. This would not eliminate volatility or prevent crises, but it might provide a floor, a backstop, a last resort anchor in a storm. Whether that's a world we want to live in, where trust has deteriorated so completely that only physical metal suffices, is a different question. But it may be the world we're building, one central bank purchase at a time. The technological dimension adds another layer. Central bank digital currencies, once a fringe topic, are now being developed by nearly 100 countries. These digital currencies promise efficiency, transparency, the ability to bypass traditional banking infrastructure. They also promise unprecedented control, the capacity for governments to track and, if necessary, freeze transactions in real time. China has already deployed its digital yuan domestically and is exploring its use in cross-border trade. The European Union is piloting a digital euro. Even the United States, traditionally cautious, is researching the possibility. If and when these currencies become widespread, the nature of reserves will change. Will central banks hold digital currencies issued by other nations? Or will they see them as even more vulnerable to political interference than traditional reserves and double down on gold? The answer is not yet clear, but the trajectory suggests the latter. In a world where money is increasingly digital, increasingly traceable, increasingly subject to control, gold's analog nature becomes a feature, not a bug. The story of gold and debt, then, is not just about economics. It's about power, trust, and the fundamental question of what holds societies together. Money is a social technology, a shared fiction that allows strangers to cooperate. For that fiction to function, it requires belief that the numbers on a screen represent value, that governments will honor their debts, that the rules won't change arbitrarily. When that belief erodes, when the fiction becomes too obviously fictional, people revert to older, more primitive forms of value. Gold is one such form. It predates modern finance, outlasted empires, survived wars and revolutions. It endures because it asks for no trust, demands no faith. It simply is. And in an age where trust is a scarce commodity, that simplicity has immense appeal. We are, whether we recognize it or not, living through a historical inflection point. The global financial system, as configured, is under stress. Not collapsing, not yet, but creaking, groaning under the weight of contradictions it can no longer contain. The rise of gold is a symptom, a warning signal, a canary in a coal mine that we've chosen to ignore. It tells us that the people responsible for managing trillions in reserves, the technocrats and bankers who understand these systems better than anyone, are hedging against outcomes they won't publicly discuss. They see risks that aren't priced into markets, vulnerabilities that aren't acknowledged in official communiques. And they're acting on those insights, quietly, incrementally, but decisively. If we were wise, we would pay attention. What would you have done if you were in their place? If you were a central banker in a mid-sized nation, watching the world's superpower freeze the reserves of a nuclear-armed rival, what calculation would you make? Would you trust that it could never happen to you? Would you bet your country's economic security on the assumption that the rules, as written, would be honored? Or would you do what Poland did, what India did, what dozens of nations are doing? Hedge, diversify, accumulate the one asset that cannot be touched. There are no easy answers. Every choice carries risk. Holding dollars exposes you to devaluation and geopolitical leverage. Holding gold costs you the interest you could earn on bonds. Doing nothing is itself a choice, a wager that the status quo will persist. And right now, fewer and fewer are willing to make that wager. The legacy of this moment will be written over decades. Future historians will look back and trace the threads: the invasion, the freeze, the buying, the price surge, and construct narratives of cause and effect that seem, in hindsight, inevitable. But we, living through it, experience only confusion and uncertainty. We see prices move, read headlines, hear experts offer conflicting forecasts. We don't know which details will matter and which will fade into footnote obscurity. That's the nature of living through history. Clarity comes later, if at all. But some patterns are already clear. The world is fragmenting. Trust is eroding. And gold, ancient and implacable, is rising to fill the void. Tell me in the comments. Do you see this as a correction, a necessary rebalancing of power away from a single dominant currency? Or is it the beginning of a fragmentation that will leave us all worse off, trapped in a low-trust world where cooperation becomes impossible? And if you crave more stories that test the limits of truth and power, that explore the hidden forces shaping our world, subscribe, because the next one might just change how you see history itself. The future is being decided now, and the choices being made by people whose names you'll never know, in rooms you'll never see, using mechanisms most of us barely understand. But the consequences will reach everyone. The war between debt and gold, between trust and tangible value, is not over. It's accelerating, and we are all, whether we know it or not, caught in its gravity.